Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Had the privilege a while back to be a part of the TV show on the History Channel called Unbelievable with Dan Aykroyd. And I've actually filmed quite a few more episodes that haven't aired yet that are going to air, I guess, probably as part of Season 3 down the road. But one of the episodes that I ended up appearing a lot in is their episode on dirty jobs. And we talked about, among others, jobs like toshers, which are people who would go down in the sewers in London and look for valuable items. We talked about chimney sweeps. We talked about the groom of the stool, who was the guy, among other things, who was responsible for the king's butt, as it sounds. So I see that Chat History has a video called The Absolute Worst Jobs in History. So I thought we'd dive into that one today, see if any of the topics that I got to cover on the History Channel are a part of it, or if we're going to learn something entirely new. The link is in the description, so you can check it out without my commentary. Let's dive into this one.
The worst jobs in history.
Gong Farmer?
If you ever think your job's crappy, try having to plunge into a pit of literal human doo-doo feces every single night. Way back in the day in good old England, some daring men made a career out of wading through human excrement. So-called Gong Farmers were tasked with draining out cesspits filled to the brim with offensive butt slop.
We actually talked about this in that episode. I don't think I appear in that part of the episode on the History Channel, but we talked about this. They just had a different name than Gong Farmer.
The profession had existed for centuries, but it saw its height between the years of 1485 and 1603, also known as the Tudor period. Oi, I got a tutor for you. Since this was way before the invention of the turlet, people were content with just slamming their cheeks down in a public latrine to pinch.
So it's fair to say, when you take a look at this image and you say it's before the invention of the toilet, it's before the invention of the modern flush toilet. What you see right there, the Romans had. The Romans had exactly that. So the idea of having a place that you went to the bathroom and it drained into something absolutely existed. If you go to Clifford's Tower, which was part of the castle, York Castle, up in York in England, you can see Henry III's toilet from 600-700 years ago. And it was actually set up with a system where rainwater would be collected, and then it was like a flush toilet. It was like kind of a cross between this and a flush toilet. But the modern flush toilet that we have today, yeah, comes later.
Off a quick loaf. The other problem was the lack of availability of somewhere to go. Towards the end of the 14th century, it's estimated that there was only one public bathroom per 2,000 people. Plus, keep in mind that all of that human waste was just piling up in a literal stone-lined hole in the ground, so you were just dropping logs onto a mountain of timber. The local government, realizing that this horrid threat to public health was fermenting beneath everyone's feet, took action to allow the construction of private outhouses and latrines in residential areas as a way to disperse the smelly sewage. It didn't work all that well. So with dookie levels rising, help was needed to drain the pits.
It's basically the early version of what many people, myself included, have, which is where you don't have access to the public sewer system, and you actually just have your own areas on your property that the stuff has to go to.
Gong Farmer. The term gong deriving from an Old English term meaning to go. They were also referred to as the much more mysterious and cooler sounding title of nightmen, as the only time that they were allowed to perform their duties was under the shroud of night, and that really sucked. There were no flashlights, spotlights, or illumination of any kind. You just had to hope that the moon was shining brightly to light your way through the filth. The nightmen would enter these cesspits and drain the contents using buckets and shovels. Excrement was loaded into barrels and carted off to be dumped near the River Thames.
And there were different jobs within the nightmen's job. You had the guy who actually went down into the pit, and then you had people who, got passed up to and dumped in, and the people who took the carts, and everybody had their own specific role. And today we still have people, for example, who do the trash collection, and it's not something we think of as a glamorous job, but it's a very necessary job, and people have to clean bathrooms, and these are important jobs that if they didn't get done, we would notice very, very quickly. When you go to a place where it hasn't been done, you notice. And these are the kinds of people we absolutely need to appreciate, and I think deserve to be paid well for these kinds of jobs.
Don't worry, it was used as fertilizer later. Maybe. These men would be knee-deep, waist-deep, even neck-deep in the stuff, which had its own risks, the first and foremost being asphyxiation. Cesspits were often enclosed spaces with little to no ventilation, so the buildup of noxious and toxic gases was a very real threat.
Yeah.
Although rare, a Gong Farmer could pass out from a lack of fresh air and drown in the waste.
Think about how rare it is now, unless you're like a police officer, for example, or a fireman, how rare it is that you hear about somebody dying on the job. It does happen. There are industrial accidents and different things like that. But it's so super rare that when it happens, we're all shocked. But realize that even 150 years ago, work, a lot of different jobs could kill you. And, I when I wrote a book about the Whitaker family, it was the most recent book that I wrote, many of them were iron puddlers and furnace men, and they worked in close proximity to molten iron. And there was one story that I wrote about in there where a guy on the job fell into the molten iron, and basically there was no body to be able to recover. And so they actually brought in the local parish priest, who just said some prayers as they poured out the molten iron that he had fallen into. It was crazy. But your job could regularly kill you even 100, 150 years ago.
Another risk was poor maintenance. Cesspits were typically drained as needed, which, depending on the size of the thing, could be up to 2 years between sloppy scoops. Since these pits just sat there and rotted, it was common for stone walls to collapse in on the farmers while they harvested their crops. Any scrapes or bumps would certainly get infected, which could only lead to a painful death. But these high risks were met with high reward. Since the job was less than desirable, Gong Farmers made quite a healthy living, about 6 pence a day. Now, I'm not quite sure what that is in non-silly sounding money, but sounds pretty good. Problem is though, Gong Farmers...
Hold on. Wanted to go look it up because I wanted to see in terms of scale what 6 pence a day in, say, 1500 was today. And it's a little bit less than the equivalent of what a skilled worker would have made, which would be more like 10 pence a day in 1500. So it's not bad, though, for what you would consider to be unskilled labor. I guess it's a decent day's wages and better than you could have made a lot of different other ways.
Perpetually reeked from their labors and were only permitted to live in certain areas of the city, with most of the public actively avoiding them and, well, treating them like crap.
This one we definitely talked about.
Now, if you're looking for a soul-crushing, body-breaking job that pays next to nothing, you're an idiot. But I could recommend that you apply for the occupation of Chimney Sweep. These services were all the rage in, you guessed it, England's Tudor period. But the job has existed for hundreds of years.
Yeah, but this was a job that existed up until closer to the modern era because you still had chimneys. And after the Great Fire of London in 1666, the new buildings that were built, the chimneys were a lot narrower, and that's when you had to have children to do the job.
Urbanization led to the construction of a lot of buildings, and each one of them suckers needs a source of heat. You gotta keep them English toesies nice and warm during the miserable gray winter months until the arrival of the miserable gray summer months. So a lot of fireplaces and chimneys were built to meet that demand. You do know how a fireplace works, right? Make fire, fire make heat and smoke go up through chimney and blow out the top. But all of that burning of wood and coal creates lots of icky, carbon-heavy, flammable deposits that build up within the chimney. Big problem, because if that's...
And if you had a decent-sized house, you had multiple chimneys, because you couldn't just have one to heat the whole house.
It's not properly cleared out, then things can just go... And there goes not only your house, but a few neighbors' houses as collateral damage. Well, the higher-ups didn't like the risk of their kingdom going up in smoke at any given time, so they mandated that chimneys must be swept at least 4 times a year or face heavy fines. Thus, the employment of chimney sweeps became critical. The problem, though, is that chimneys at the time weren't exactly designed for human entry and cleaning. Bugger. Most flue networks in the building were grouped together on the roof, but could have sharp turns as they angled out towards their respective fireplaces or furnaces. To make matters even worse, regulations shrunk flue sizes down to as little as 9 by 9 inches. This made it nearly impossible for full-grown men to slip through the cracks.
And this is why I was saying, I mean, he talks about it being the Tudor period, but by the time you get those regulations, you're dealing with the post-London fire era, so this is long after the Tudor period.
The solution? Children.
Kids. Yep.
Really young children. Adorable, wide-eyed orphans were yoinked from poor houses and taken on as apprentices called climbing boys, with opportunities to one day grow into master sweepers themselves, if they lived that long. If it wasn't obvious, chimney sweeping was extremely dangerous, especially for the little limber lads. Boys as young as 6 years old were sent up chimneys and told to get scrubbing. The physical dangers were abundant, as several children had died from getting stuck or horribly burned from scaling the scalding bricks.
Yeah, we told the story on the History Channel episode about one of those kids that got stuck, and they called in everybody they could to kind of do a rescue effort, but they just couldn't get him out in time.
Keep in mind that these fireplaces were almost always in use, so those chimneys were hot and ready like a carry-out pizza. Now, if the cramming didn't kill you, the scrubbing would. Soot and creosote, the organic carbonaceous byproducts of burning wood and coal, are carcinogenic. So if you're trapped in a confined space, just scrub-a-dub-dubbing away while sucking up hits of cancer-causing black powder all day hurt.
If not cancer, then you were dealing with things that what we call today COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which a lot of people get from smoking, but back then they could get from being an iron puddler and breathing in the fumes all the time from that. Sometimes it would be diagnosed as bronchitis, but it was really just COPD. Breathing in this stuff all the time, brutal, short lifespan.
Day, things are not going to turn out well for you. But it actually wasn't your lungs that you needed to worry about. No, it was your balls. Scrotal squamous cell carcinoma, also known as chimney sweep's carcinoma, or just straight up scrotal cancer, was a death sentence. Something I didn't mention until now was that the young children, as a way to fit easier into the narrow hot chimneys, often went commando. No shirt, no shoes, no pants, but all service. The constant exposure to soot and such led to the development of tumors on their nethers.
Wow.
Once developed,
I didn't know that.
they were lucky if they had a few years left in them. Sure, your sack is out of whack, but damn, that chimney's clean. You've probably heard of the radium girls, young women of the workforce that would paint luminous numbers and hands onto timepieces in the early 1900s. Well, this is similar. Towards the end of the 19th century, matchmaking was a pretty lucrative business. Not like pairing couples up, but making literal matches.
Oh.
By the late 1800s, there were about 25 matchmaking factories across Great Britain, employing over 4,000 chaps and chapettes.
British.
The process, as with most industries at the time, involved working with some nasty chemicals. The flavor of the day here was white phosphorus, an unstable compound that burned fiercely when ignited. You know, perfect for the few seconds that you would need to set something ablaze. On top of being...
And like everything else, humans found a way to use white phosphorus in warfare, and so it was something that was commonly used as an incendiary device during war. You'd have tanks firing white phosphorus, and it could be dropped, it could be thrown in hand grenades.
Easily ignitable and violently reactive with oxygen, it had the triple whammy of also being extremely toxic. Of all matchmaking jobs, roughly half were involved in the direct handling of white phosphorus, with over 80% of the phosphorus fingerers being young women. These women would come to be known as matchstick girls. Day in and day out, these women were tasked with packaging the dipped matchsticks, with an entire workforce handling as many as 10 million across a 10-hour shift, meeting the demand of the 250 million matches being burned in Britain every single day.
Jeez.
Remember that fire is what got people through the day. Need to cook? Fire. Need to keep warm? Fire. Need to see in the dark? Fire. Need to shrink your overhead? Fire. It was the biggest blessing humanity has ever discovered, and you can now summon it out of a little box in your pocket. The obvious problem is that fiddling with all of those fickle phosphorus fumes physically fucked you up. It was very common for both men and women to form phosphoric necrosis of the jaw.
Oh, wow.
The condition, nicknamed Fossy Jaw, developed after the long-term exposure to phosphorus fumes.
Jobs could kill you, even if they didn't kill you instantly by like dying in a mine or something like that. It killed you over time. This is one of the many reasons why when I hear people of the latest generation talk about how no generation has ever had it worse, I say, shut up. You have no idea what you're talking about. Think about the stuff that people did, and these were like 12, 13, 14-year-olds sometime going to these jobs that would kill them.
Initial symptoms included simple toothaches, which evolved into complete tooth loss, abscesses, swelling of the gums, and complete necrosis of the jaw. To put it simply, your jaw rotted off. If you did get the jaw rot, there was about a 1 in 5 chance that the rest of your body would be rotting not long after from contracting an even worse condition known as death. In 1888, over 1,400 matchstick girls, fed up with this blatant disregard for their safety, decided to strike, demanding better pay, working conditions, and abolition of unfair fines and penalties. The strike lasted for 2 weeks before demands were met and accepted.
And these are the kinds of things throughout history that were necessary in order to, it's only, turn of the century here in the United States, get around the year 1900, Theodore Roosevelt, president, where you start to get these regulations on some of these jobs and on our food and things like that, where you start to say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't have jobs and food that kill us, and starting to deal with that stuff. That's why sometimes, even though I come from a conservative side of things politically, sometimes government regulation is not only necessary, it's actually a good thing for us.
Years later, in 1908, the British House of Commons completely banned the use of toxic white phosphorus in favor of the much safer and less toxic red phosphorus, which is what we use in matches today, but not in the match head, on the striking pad. So remember to light one up for the matchstick girls. If you think your job's exhausting, try hauling an entire freaking ship up a river with your bros. These are burlacs, or barge haulers. They hauled barges. Typically dirt poor peasants just looking for enough coin to eat for a week, these men were tasked with strapping on a strap and using whatever strength they had left in them to pull in ships from the Caspian Sea all the way up the Volga River in the days of the Russian Empire. Since ship traffic was near constant thanks to strong trade, burlacs were in high demand to carefully guide the vessels up the Volga. But why couldn't the ships just sail up the river, you might ask? Because the Volga flows outward towards the Caspian Sea, and there were rarely favorable winds to propel a ship up the river, lest you risk beaching your entire ship on the banks. So why not hire a bunch of exhausted and desperate poor people to do the work instead? Whoa, slow down fellas, there's no need for us to be Russian. Depending on the load size, burlac groups could range from just a few men up to 150 fellas pulling a single ship. Women. But there was a moment of respite for these workers. See, one advantage to working in the Russian Empire was the cold winters. Can't exactly move ships upstream when the waterways are completely frozen over. So burlacs were seasonal, working dawn until dusk, thaw till frost. But since the combination of being poor and not working meant certain death, the men would pick up odd jobs in the winter to barely scrape by.
Hey, I make a duck. Smudge, smudge.
So often throughout history, people just did whatever they had to survive. I mean, it literally was survival. And I'm not discounting the fact that there are many people, even in Western industrialized nations, that are still living, barely surviving. And so I do want to recognize that. But, it was a lot worse. It was much, much worse at the time. And yet people did it.
At the beginning of the 19th century, it is estimated that about 600,000 burlacs worked in the Russian Empire. But the evolution of ship technology and the invention of the steam-powered ship rendered the job obsolete. By the end of the 19th century, the burlac profession had vanished over the horizon. Now I know what you're thinking, so stop it. This has nothing to do with milking your own snake or giving little pinches to little snake nips, which don't exist. Snakes aren't mammals. The job of a snake milker was to extract their venom from their fangs. He looks cute, right? Think again. Snake venom was highly coveted for use in early warfare as a biological weapon, granting you the ability to proc tick damage over time to your enemies if you weren't able to finish them off yourself. Perhaps the best weapons of choice to get slathered in the stuff were arrows. Lethality of arrows varied greatly. Take one in the skull? Yeah, sure, you're dead as a doornail. But take one in a less critical spot like an arm or a leg, assuming you don't sever an artery, and you might just live to see another day. But that's
unacceptable. We have to find a way to make an arm or a leg shot fatal as well. Let's tip it with something.
All goes out the window if the arrow tip was dipped in some venomous drip. Quite a few civilizations have been noted for using envenomed or poisoned arrows throughout history.
Listen, this just goes back to the idea once again that if human beings can find a way to weaponize something, we will do it. Fire, we'll weaponize it. Disease, we'll weaponize it. Poison, let's weaponize it. whatever it takes.
You've got the Khoisan people of southern Africa who have been using poisoned arrows for thousands of years in hunting large prey, and the Harmatilians who used viper venom against an invading Alexander the Great. But no army employed the use of snake venom better than the Scythians. Also duking it out against Alexander the Great, the Scythians developed their own iconic poison for warfare, combining not only viper venom, but also putrefied human blood and excrement. Even minor scrapes from their weapons were lethal. So on top of dealing with being envenomed, you also dealt with the horrors of gangrene and tetanus. So with all that said and done, yeah, snake milkers. Like I said, it was their job to wrangle and wrestle up enough snakes to meet the demand of entire armies.
And initially, in a job like this, the first people to do it are going to figure out very quickly, or they're going to demonstrate for the people who come after them how not to do it. But eventually they're going to figure out the system. They're going to figure out where they can grab the snake, how they can disable the snake from being able to bite them, what tools they can use so that they don't have to touch the snake directly while they're picking it up. Eventually they're going to be able to make this a less lethal kind of job.
But luckily, this wasn't a time for catch and release practices. Kill the snakes, take their venom. That's the job. Of course, that is easier said than done. By nature, snakes are shy little fellas and pretty hard to find. Chances are you get struck before you even noticed one. One catch of their fangs is enough for it to be game over. Snake milkers were considered lucky if they even managed to survive a single round of collecting.
I think it's time for a quick science lesson. Venoms can be sorted into three main types: neurotoxic, hemotoxic, cytotoxic. Yikes. Neurotoxins strike and destroy all your nerves. You're agonized and paralyzed, as you can observe. Hemotoxins target all your healthy blood, thinning down or clotting up, so now you're done for, bud. Cytotoxins focus on killing all your cells, so you can probably guess that you won't be doing well. Just avoid snakes, and you'll be doing fine. I know you fellas and fellettes just love a good rhyme. So to close this chapter
I'm impressed by the poem. Well done. Good job.
out, yes, snake milkers still exist nowadays, though only for medical
Yeah.
research and developing antivenom rather than biological warfare. Or so we think.
Imagine getting ready to charge onto a battlefield to either invade a country or defend your own. You see your fellow soldiers gearing up for battle with their trusty firearms, and you're given a drum. Ugh. I gotta fight. Drummers, believe it or not, were a critical part of warfare in
Yeah.
the days of yore. Since there were no such things as radios or more instantaneous methods of communication, drummer boys were employed and trained to maintain order on the battlefield, signaling commands, attacks, retreats, and everything in between.
Yeah, drummers and buglers. So in the American Civil War, I'm intimately familiar with this right now because I'm writing a book on a company of soldiers. Each company in a regiment, an infantry regiment had 10 companies. Each company had a drummer and a bugler. And that way, if you're giving orders to a particular company rather than the entire regiment, you can do that. Often had a fifer as well, but they didn't have a role in battle the way that drummers and buglers did.
Peaking in popularity during the American Civil War, drummer boys were typically in their teenage years or young adulthood, though some more famous drummer boys were much younger.
Right, but most weren't. We use the term drummer boy, and everybody imagines that every company had this 9-year-old playing drums for them. That was the exception, not the rule. Company H of the 20th Ohio that I'm writing about right now, their bugler was 30 years old. Their fifer was 30 years old, and their drummer, who was my great-great-great-uncle, was 16 when he enlisted, so he was 19 by the time he got to the end of his 3 years of service.
Little Charlie King of the Union Army died in battle at the age of just 13, being the youngest casualty in the Battle of Antietam. Itty-bitty Johnny Clem ran away from
Ohio.
home and was taken in by the Union Army as a drummer boy at the ripe old age of 9.
They call him the drummer boy of Chickamauga because there's a famous story about him shooting a rebel at Chickamauga. By then he was like 12. He's from Ohio, ended up enlisting in a Michigan regiment because the Ohio regiment wouldn't take him initially as young as he was. You can see he's got sergeant stripes. He's actually buried at Arlington National Cemetery, real close to Robert E. Lee's house.
Just a few years later, the little fella fought in the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863 at the age of 12, where he shot and killed a Confederate soldier.
What you gonna do? Shoot?
He was promoted to sergeant, eventually retiring from the United States Army in 1915 as a brigadier general.
Yep.
but that's a rare occurrence. In reality, it would have gone more like this. Despite what people may think, drummer boys did not lead troops into battle. That would
No.
be stupid. Instead, they would relay commands from behind soldier lines, though.
And then they would often help serve as, musicians often help serve as stretcher bearers and helped in the aftermath of things. But, I mean, they were there. Don't get it wrong. Just because they were behind the others doesn't mean they were in tremendously less danger than others. They were definitely in danger.
They were still known to be valuable targets. If you break the communication line, you break down the army. Outside of combat, drummer boys had a wealth of other responsibilities, such as carrying messages between units, assisting battlefield surgeons with amputations, carting the wounded off the field, fetching supplies, or burying the dead. They very rarely carried weapons of their own, so if they had to defend themselves in the heat of battle, they were pretty shit out of luck. If you wanted to be one of the most influential people in all of England but don't have a drop of royal blood in you, you'd want to squeeze into the role of the Groom of the Stool.
Yep.
A job requiring you to get up real close and personal with the king or queen at the time. Look, we all have to go once or 12 times a day, so someone as prestigious and important as the king is going to need help doing so.
I love how we keep showing Henry VIII. Listen, important note, I've done videos about Henry VIII before. Henry VIII was only fat the last, 10, 12 years of his life. He was actually a very athletic, handsome, good-looking guy for most of his life. It's only in his later years he gets into a jousting accident. He gets this ulcer on his leg that he suffers with for the rest of his life. It never completely heals. It smells. It affects his mobility. And as his mobility slows down and he becomes less athletic, he starts getting fat and ugly and stinky. And that's the Henry VIII most people think of.
I mean, imagine feeling the sudden urge to blow out your britches, but you have to fight through said britches to accomplish the mission. Grooms of the Stool assisted the monarch with any labors regarding biological movements. This included helping the removal of clothing, preparation of the lavish and luxurious royal ship box, and the removal of the splendiferous solids, but not before their proper examination. Yeah,
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right, because the health of the monarch is state property. I mean, this is like, it's important knowledge to have, and so analyzing what comes out is part of keeping an eye on the health of the monarch.
Grooms of the Stool were not only tasked with cleaning up the royal slurry, but making sure that the passings were healthy, taking notes of any abnormalities in appearance or frequency.
I need your
These
poop
notes
report.
would be passed on to the king's personal physician to diagnose any possible ailments. Well, that's not very helpful, is it? After the log was sent down the river, the Groom of the Stool would also assist in the cleanup effort, either by handing the king his own personal cleaning cloth, or by taking up wiping duties themselves. Now, you might think that this job sucked, but it was actually highly coveted and well respected as
Anything that gets you in close proximity to the monarch on a regular basis, especially in its most intimate moments, is a sought-after gig. It doesn't matter. I mean, you had some of the most high-ranking officials in the kingdom having jobs like being the cupbearer to the king. It seems like a menial task for a servant, but no, that's access. That's really prime access to the monarch.
Grooms of the Stool had access to the king outside of the public eye, allowing for valuable private conversations. Commonly high-ranking nobles or politicians, Grooms of the Stool were known to have influence in many formal rulings, laws, or personal life. So that Anne Boleyn chick's hot, right? No. The first documented Groom
Henry
of the Stool
VII.
dates all the way back to 1495 under King Henry VII. The role continued to evolve over the years to the title of Groom of the Stool, though they were more so referred to as either the gentleman or gentlewoman of the bedchamber, depending on the monarch in charge, with responsibilities eventually focusing solely on the king or queen's wardrobe. The position was held for over 400 years until being formally discontinued under King Edward VII in 1901. Well, that's that video. I have plenty
All
more.
right, that was good. Hopefully you
terrible
learned
jobs
some
for-
things. Work is not always glamorous, but it is necessary. What would you add to the list? Is there another job you can think of that we haven't talked about that definitely should be talked about? Thanks for watching.